So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and in this video I'm going to be doing some upgrades to this boat. I got a 24-foot Teague. So I got this boat pretty cheap because of the shape it was in. However, it is going to take a couple grand to get it the way I want it. In this video, I'm actually going to be fixing the wakeboard racks because the ropes were broke on all three racks. Plus, there was missing a rubber, and some of the rubber was also coming off. So let's get to it. So the first step was to cut the old heat shrink off covering the ropes that were broke. So I'm just using a razor knife to do this. I'm cutting all four sides, just running the blade along the side of the aluminum. So this is our new boxer puppy, so you'll start seeing him in our videos now. I lost my old boxer, Harvey, due to a tumor a couple months back. Just wanted to say we love you, buddy, and you will be missed. So I was trying to be a little careful with this first one to show you guys how they had done the rope, because they actually used like a small hog ring to hold the rope together, whereas when I'm doing it, I'm just going to use a couple knots. So after cutting all four sides, I used a pair of dikes to assist in cutting the rest of the heat shrink. So this rack was a little bit more of a pain than probably most racks are because the bungee is in the center of the rack and pulls to each side. Most of them just pull from one side to the other. If yours is that way, it's very similar to my wake surf rack, I'm sure, and I'll be doing that later in this video. There's a view of those steel rings I was telling you about. We're just going to use a couple knots instead. So when trying to find this bungee cord, I tried searching wakeboard rack bungee, and that didn't do me much good. I went on Amazon and searched adjustable bungee material, and I pulled up this marine grade bungee that was 1/4 inch thick, and I got 50 feet of it. Surprisingly enough, each rope was about 7 feet long. So right here, I'm just running it through the hole, making sure that I have equal lengths on both sides. Then I tied an overhand knot, but left it loose. Then I took each end and ran it through the loose overhand knot, making sure that both loops were equal in length. Then I cinched the overhand knot to hold the ends in place. So I had to play a little bit of a guessing game with the initial length because I had nothing to match it up to. Hopefully you've got one of the bungees still on yours for a reference. So this is actually the third one, and I'm just checking to make sure my length is good. The first two, I did all my knots before checking it, and then I had to undo all my knots and start over because I was too long. So right here, I'm just checking it to make sure my adjustment is good before doing the rest of the knots. So I was still a little too long for the smaller board. So right here, I'm just tightening them up a little bit more. And since I've only done the one overhand knot, it tightened up without a problem. This did take a couple times to get it where I thought I had a good enough tension on the wakeboard. Now I'm doing an overhand knot from the end to the opposing rope on each one. That is the best way I can explain it. Double checking it to make sure both loops are the same length. And then I tried it with the wakeboard in it one more time to make sure we're good. Trying both ropes on the same wakeboard. And then I went ahead and did one more overhand knot just to make sure that it did not loosen up on me. Then I went ahead and took a pair of dikes and cut off the remaining ends of the bungee, leaving about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch so there wasn't a possibility of them loosening off. So right here I've got some heat shrink and I'm just putting it over all four ropes. Using a heat gun, I shrunk that down because the heat shrink that I used at first would not fit over the knots. So I ended up going to Lowe's and getting some bigger heat shrink that starts at 1.5 inches and says it will shrink down to 1/2 of an inch. So the bigger heat shrink, I went in and cut each piece in half. So I grabbed 2 boxes to do what I had to do. So for heat shrink, I've used a lighter or a butane torch. However, for this, I wanted to go get an actual heat gun because I did not want to damage the bungee material in the process of shrinking it down. I placed the heat shrink over the aluminum, and I went ahead and put it over the rubber inserts that are in the aluminum, so it helps hold those from possibly walking out as well. And using the heat gun again, I shrunk those down until they were tight against the aluminum and the previous heat shrink that I had put on. And I think it's a good idea that I put the second heat shrink on because I don't know if that 1.5 inches would have shrunk all the way down without that other heat shrink on the rope. So now we're going to redo the wake surf rack, which is much easier because it is just a single rope going from side to side. So I took 2 pieces of small heat shrink and put them over the rope. Then I ran the rope through the first hole in the rack and tied an overhand knot. Then pulled the rope tight against the knot and moved the heat shrink down to the rack on the other side and proceeded to heat that up so it would hold the rope from falling out of the rack. So once again, since I had nothing to go off of and I don't have a wake surf board yet, I plan on getting one. I just used a wakeboard as a reference and just made it a little on the loose side because the wake surf boards are a little wider. So I tested how tight that was, then I went ahead and cut it to length, leaving a little bit of extra just in case. Then I ran the rope through the other side of the rack and went ahead and tied that same overhand knot, moved the heat shrink down on that side and heated it up as well. Once that was good, I cut the excess off the back of the bungee, leaving about a 1/2 inch or so. Then I put a little piece of heat shrink on each end to keep the bungee from fraying and heated that up as well. After all that was done, I tried it out, made sure I was good on my length, and I decided to go ahead and put a handle on this rope as well. So I decided to go ahead and just use a piece of bungee to do this, and I doubled up the bungee and then just did an overhand knot. Then I went in and cut both ends off and looped it around the bungee and pulled it tight to create a cinch. Then just took a piece of heat shrink and put it over the knot to keep it from backing off. So on one of my racks, the rubber was coming off and I used a 2-part epoxy. I got it at the dollar store actually. And you just squirt the tubes out, mix it until you get a uniformed color on the epoxy. And then just using a wooden stick, I dabbed it in the slot where the rubber goes into the rack. One mistake I did make while doing this was I figured the epoxy would kind of hold the rubber up in place when I flipped it over to do the other side. However, it did not. And then I had to go find clamps to hold the rubber. So the epoxy dried up by the time I got the clamps and was able to do the other side. So I wasted 1/2 a tube of this epoxy. So just keep that in mind. You might want to have some clamps or rubber bands ready to hold this rubber in place so you have time to do the other side if necessary. Not that it was a big deal. I just had to run back to the dollar store and get more epoxy. It actually worked out well having the small tubes because it dries so quick. I would use a tube, get as far as I could, then grab another tube. So as far as the one that was missing the rubber in the rack, I was digging around in what I had, and I had this old set of useless jumper cables. Look at how thin that wire is. It's basically good for an RC car. So I'm always one for trying to reuse stuff and make use out of stuff instead of going and buying something. I hang on to all my old appliance cords. One is I do a lot of wiring for my fish tank stuff, and I use these for that. But if I hadn't had this jumper cable left over, I would have used one of these old appliance cords because, again, you still have that rubber insulation over the wires. The only reason I used the jumper cable is it just felt a little bit snugger in that aluminum. If I hadn't had the jumper cable, I would have just used this old appliance cord in place of that rubber as well. So I used that. It fit well in the groove, and the rubber insulation was a mirror image of what was already in the rack. So I stripped it back a little bit and then cut it to length. Then using the same epoxy that I used to do the other repairs, I spread it out. I tried to get it tucked under the heat shrink for the ropes, but I couldn't get that done and I was worried about it drying up, so I just went ahead and laid it out the best I could. I had a little bit too much epoxy in a couple spots, so I had to wipe that up immediately. This time I had the clamps ready to clamp it so I could flip it over and continue to do the epoxy. Soon after I got both sides done, I did have a little bit of excess epoxy on it. I was able to use a razor knife along the aluminum to clean it up as best I could. There's still a little bit there, but overall I'm pretty happy with the end result. And since I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, I will probably pull the wakeboard racks down every time and stick them under the boat cover just so the sun's not beating the crap out of them all the time. There's a quick view of the first one I did. I did have red heat shrink, so I went ahead and used it up. I thought I had enough to do both and didn't end up and couldn't find the red heat shrink, so I do end up with two different colors, but oh well. So these were the first two that I did, so you can see the knots are even bulkier. Then this was the third one, and this was the fourth one. So I kind of got better as I went. There's my handle. Good view of the finished product on that. So one of these has the jumper cable in it, and one does not. So just to show you, you can't really tell. The only reason you can tell is because I've got that little bit of extra epoxy on the side here. But this is the jumper cable I put in, and this is what the original is. Hope you guys enjoyed this video and it gave you some good information. If you enjoyed it, please hit like and subscribe if you haven't already, and hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.